Hey everybody, welcome back to another video. Now this video is going to be about how Capcom could remake Devil May Cry 1. Now this game is very old. It is the staple and the introduction of the hack and slash genre, and for me, this video, I had to be in a different mindset when writing the script and coming up with some ideas, because I didn't want to take away from things that were a staple of the game, but I also wanted to approach it in a more versatile way. Because with my Devil May Cry 2 video, I kind of tried to expand on some elements of existing gameplay and refine and improve the more terrible side of things. With my Devil May Cry 3 video, I tried to, with the gameplay, take the foundations, improve upon it, and kind of leave the stuff that didn't need to be touched alone, but improve the stuff that did need to be messed with. But with this game's very old. This was the staple of the hack and slash genre, but it also wears its Resident Evil influence and stuff like that on its shoulders. It was originally made to be an RE4, but it turned out to become its own thing. So that's something I felt like it would be hard to take away, and I kind of want to keep that. And I managed to strike a balance with keeping some things without taking away other things. Let's start off with combat, because DMC 1's combat is very basic. It is a staple of its genre. It does have a few fixed camera angles and stuff like that, but it mainly relies on juggling enemies and having to go to the menu to switch your weapons and stuff like that. It's very basic. I wanted to take the foundations of it, and originally I was planning on thinking, well, if DMC 1 was remade, why not just give it style switching? But I realized that was a staple of the new games, and it took us a while to get to that, and DMC 1 didn't have that. Debated whether to actually include it in this remake, and I thought it would be better if it wasn't included. This remake, it would be mainly about your devil trigger and switching your weapons. Kind of taking influence from the reboot, where you didn't have styles. It was all about, switching your weapons, using like your devil trigger, and that's it. So I thought, okay, why not have this remake of DMC 1 take the foundations of the original's combat, where it's about juggling enemies, timing your shots, and switching between your different weapons. But this time you don't have to go to the menu. You can just kind of, like in Devil May Cry 5, use the L2 and R2 button. So I thought that would be a good foundation. With this remake, I wanted to align it similarly to what the gameplay was for the previous games, but still keep it within that old style. And it's mainly just about using your weapons to effectively and bringing up your style meter, and slightly using the environment to your advantage. Now, getting into some of your weapons, you do have Force Edge, Alistair, Ifrit, and a few new ones. Because this is a remake, I want to get into more of some surprises later on. But the swords will be changed up, especially Force Edge, being a little bit less basic. Having some interesting mechanics, because this is DMC 1 for crying out loud, I wanted to change a lot of things up. So I wanted to borrow a little bit from some moves that Virgil has in Devil May Cry 5 when doing this. And also pulling from the Arkham scene from Devil May Cry 3, I wanted to give Force Edge some new ways that it attacks, and also kind of stops time a little bit. The mechanics with Devil May Cry are more basic and stuff like that, so I kind of wanted to take it a little bit old school, but it still has the modern game's flair. I wanted to improve the old weapons, so Force Edge would have a lot of new abilities, and same for Alistair and stuff like that. For Force Edge, it would feel less basic, and you can also transform into your devil trigger with it, but it would slightly come at a risk because you can't get health back when you're in your devil trigger with this sword. A little bit of risk with a high reward, with more powerful moves, and it being more interesting to use this time around. When it comes to the changes of Force Edge, I didn't want it to have the Rebellion and Sparta problem that DMC 5 had. I have a lot of new moves, but getting from that sword to, well, Alistair, now this is where a lot of the cooler changes would happen. Alistair would have a lot more moves, same for Ifrit, but this time around, it would probably be your go-to for most of the time. It's a lot more amazing to use with its electricity, and a lot more combos that you can mess around with it, taking some influence from Devil May Cry 5's Devil Sword Dante, and a few others. You could get some new weapons, but I haven't really came up with any ideas for the 2 new weapons you could get, and the 2 new guns. Because, obviously, I just didn't have the time. When it comes to combat, I roughly wanted to take influence mainly from the reboot, and you can switch between your guns and swords only, kind of like playing DMC5 without style switching, just switching between your guns and memorizing your combos and stuff like that. If you have any ideas for how you would do combat, let me know. But getting into story, I would roughly keep the story very similar to the original, but with a lot of tweaks and removing those god-awful water sections. No one liked them, no one wants them, and I don't even think for a remake we should keep them. If anything, we could make a idle gag for one of the scenes with Dante mentioning it. I personally would like the simplicity of the story. Dante is lured to Malay Island by Mundous and stuff like that. The only difference is I would roughly change a bit of the opening. Now, before anyone gets pissed, we're still having Dante and Trish meet the same way, slightly tweaked, but roughly the same way, because this is as much her story as it is Dante's, and I wouldn't change that. What I would change with the opening is Trish's creation, getting to see it and having Mundous create her, Nightmare, Phantom, Griffin, and all that, before basically luring Dante and stuff like that. I want to see her creation, and I'm sure a lot of people want to see that as well. Plus, getting to see Trish's creation would be interesting, because getting to see like Mundous create Nightmare, create Phantom, create Griffin, all that stuff, and like, well, how could I get Dante here? And he remembers Dante's mother, and it's like, huh. And he creates Trish. That would be a very interesting change to the opening, and then you get to see her just show up and then beat the crap out of Dante and stuff like that. And that would be a better change to the opening compared to the original. Would just see her fly in out of nowhere and then show up. Seeing her actually get created would be interesting. But another change to the story is actually giving Trish a playable campaign that parallels with Dante's journey. Trish, this is her game as much as it is Dante's, because she does have a mild arc in the original, but the thing is, she was just there. And with this, I feel like taking influence from Separate Ways and a few other things, we can actually give her more to do, besides just being someone in the background that shows up when she needs to and when she doesn't. Like she's not around. So I feel like giving her her own little missions and stuff like that, that parallel in with the story, would kind of change things up. Even getting to see Mundus's cruelty and just realize that she's only just a pawn. And kind of give her more of an arc than what she had in the OG would be a lot more interesting, and I don't know what you can do with her missions, but it would slightly change stuff up for the better. The change I would make is in the story. You do get the sword the same way, but there is a puzzle that releases a spirit into a boss fight that you have with Alistair, and you also have another one with Ifrit later on, very similar, slightly tweaked a little bit, but I think it would be cool to make sure they're boss fights first, and then you get to see the weapons. And their introductions would roughly be the same, with some minor tweaks. And from there, DMC1 is technically a more linear thing, but it does have a lot with Resident Evil. So it would have a map and stuff like that. I don't want to shy away from the horror setting of Malay Island and the castle, and if I'm being honest, that was the best part of it. But it also, I feel, needs a little bit of a lot of tweaking around the feature where you the game directs you where you actually need to go would be better suited for this game, because Malay Island is very big and it is easy to get lost. Unlike 5, where the levels are linear, similar to the OG of 1, but I feel that the OG of DMC1 had a map. You had room to backtrack and stuff like that. Personally, I want to take a DMC5 approach where you don't need a map. Yes, Malay Island and the castle is very big, but you always technically know where to go. you shouldn't have to have the map in the first place. And with giving us the button from 5 where it redirects you if you get lost, then we obviously have a better understanding. If we can tweak the level structure just a little bit and stuff like that, and the castle, and keep a lot of the puzzles, but tweak them a little, I feel like the map would be a lot more better this time around. We can slightly tweak stuff, but I feel like removing the map aspect of it, but still keeping that Resident Evil style of gameplay that DMC1 is known for, that I do not want to take away, I feel like we can have a brilliant remake. Plus, with the idea of the castle, it is, narrow hallways and certain rooms and blah blah blah. You always technically get a feel of where to go and where not to go, because a lot of areas are blocked off anyways. So we can change a lot, especially when it comes to some of the puzzles. And it's less take one item to this location, this item to that location, and the staple of Resident Evil. It's a little bit of that, but you also have some new style of stuff that works to the game's advantage. Plus, secret missions are still in the game, and holy water is completely gone. The orb system that we had in DMC5 was perfect. I roughly would keep it the same. It worked for 5, it could work for this. I didn't have any problems with it, so yeah. Also, let's get into some enemy stuff and new boss fights. Or should I say, mini-bosses. Saying earlier in the video, you would solve a puzzle that would release a spirit, one that you would have to fight, for Alistair. Same thing would happen with Ifrid, so you would have 2 new mini-bosses that you would have to fight. Kinda wanted to take influence from the shadow fight, so once they're defeated, a spirit would fly off, and later on, you would encounter the weapon. So it would slightly change stuff up. Cutscene that basically where you unlock them would roughly stay the same. Now, this game would have a Bloody Palace mode, Trish would be playable, and we would have to tweak her heavily because this is a DMC1 Trish. Besides that, her campaign missions, I would roughly kind of have her maybe running errands, maybe even unlocking pathways for Dante. Or, in general, maybe making some things more difficult. Who knows? Even maybe some of the enemies would attack her. They don't care. They're blindly obedient to the whims of Mundus, so in a sense, maybe it's to test her loyalty. She does have to fight her way through stuff. And I would love to see a cutscene of what happens with Virgil, like in the manga, where he's corrupted by Mundus, and also getting some interesting new stuff. Kind of like with DMC5, with the Rule of 3 boss fights with Shadow, Griffin, and all of them. Hell, Special Edition should be more of a blast this time around. But when it comes to a lot of the enemy types, we could get into that now. Into enemies, I roughly liked what we had in DMC1, but there's a lot that I feel like could get cut and replaced with something better suited. So, starting off, the marionettes are roughly going to be the same. I roughly would change up a lot of the ways they attack, them being very slow, kind of taking an Ampusa approach from Devil May Cry 5, because I liked how they were handled, and stuff like that. Basically, the Frosts, roughly how they were in 4, slightly tweaked, overhauled a little, but roughly keep them the same. I personally think they are a good addition that changed things up a lot. So, roughly, keep them here. As for a few other enemies, I would personally cut maybe a few, but I would roughly keep most of them. The nobodies are a definite stay. How they were in Devil May Cry 5 was perfect, so roughly we keep them mostly the same, or maybe change them up just a little bit so they're not like 5 completely, but mostly how they were, because I didn't have a problem with them. We can keep, or we can slightly tweak them, but roughly I would cut maybe a few. Some that really didn't deserve a lot of purpose, and maybe giving us some brand new enemies that really set the bar and are more aesthetically better with the castle and all that other stuff. And there was a few designs in Devil May Cry 5 concept art that I felt were perfect for DMC1 as like for the remake. There are a few enemies I would roughly tweak heavily. The purple electric bats I would tweak a lot because I did not personally like how they were handled. And there are a few, like a hunter, but some of the bug-based enemies and a few other ones. The scissors, I would keep them hard, but roughly tweak them a lot, because they... oh boy, they were the bane of our existence in this game. So I want to keep aspects of them intact, still, you know. The skulls, or the basic skulls, yeah, we're getting rid of those, or we're slightly tweaking them. If anything, we're going to be adding some new enemies that I feel that are better suited for DMC1's remake. Some that better suit the medieval tone and really work within this theme that were scrapped enemies for Devil May Cry 5 that didn't make it in, but I personally have a feeling they would work better. And also, we could slightly take some ideas with the nobodies and slightly tweak some aspects of them for this remake. But I roughly want to give us some new enemies that are better suited for this style of remake. Keeping a few old ones, obviously, but, you know, stuff like that. Even the marionettes, we could take DMC4's Scarecrow approach, and the same with the Frosts, and roughly keep that, but tweak it, make it better, in a sense. That's how I would handle some of the enemies, is giving us new and a lot of old. Moving on to boss fights. Now, starting off with Griffin, I personally love this boss fight. An air-based boss is more about range and height, so the way he fights you, he complements that. In a sense, I wanted to take influence from Artemis. Now, this was the perfect fight in Devil May Cry 5 that evolves the air, but it also is about getting up to her, and also getting her down to you. So I wanted to apply that with Griffin. I wanted to give Griffin a few new moves, obviously, and he is a big bird, so maybe he could even create his baby Griffins, which you would have to fight as well, because this was a scrapped enemy in Devil May Cry 1's concept art, but also would create, like, different attacks, so wind, and it's more about range with his electric balls, keeping your distance, all that stuff, and I wanted to keep that aspect intact, but still take aspects from the Artemis fight that really work for this boss. And I feel like when they designed Artemis's boss fight, they had to take influence from Griffin, so I want to kind of do a bit of a reverse. Obviously dodging electricity and stuff like that, but slightly tweaking things. Moving on to the next boss fight, Nello Angelo. Now, roughly, this would be our brother Virgil, and this would be no joke. Obviously, with the rule of 3 bosses and stuff like that, Nello Angelo was the one boss that I had trouble coming up with ideas for, but then I realized there's the perfect boss to take influence from, making the remake version of Nello Angelo's fights very similar to the Cavalier Angelo fights. 2 combatants with equal amount of skill. And I feel like that would improve the Nello Angelo fights greatly. Even giving the final fight a little bit more of a challenge, where, similar to Ghost of Tsushima, he can kind of, use different sword techniques and stuff like that. So I kind of even want to throw some new patterns in with every boss. Nello Angelo is no exception. I wanted to make him even less of a pushover and more of a challenge. And him being very equal to Dante when it comes to the way he fights you and stuff like that, even though he's controlled by Mundus, he would be very challenging and you're equal in every single way. Obviously, even giving his summon swords in your final encounter, and some new moves, obviously, but he could even taunt you and do some pretty cool new stuff. Taking his sword in the ground and maybe sending up a shockwave, and some new stuff. You would obviously, similar to the Cavalier Angelo fight, it would be about, hitting your swords at the same time, or even dodging and doing a lot of other interesting stuff. But it would be less about guns, because guns wouldn't work on him as well, but sword fighting and stuff like that. Moving on to Phantom. Now, this is a fight that was very interesting. I roughly wanted to keep it the same, give Phantom a lot of new moves, slightly treat it like the Gilgamesh fight, but without the traversal elements, where his armor is naturally very thick, so you have to hit him in a good weak point. So I would slightly tweak it,
kind of similar, make it similar to the Gilgamesh fight and the Malphus fight from Devil May Cry 5, giving him some new fire-based attacks, and he only gets stronger when you fight him again in his second and third encounter, and even pulling out new moves that in those encounters that really throw you for a loop. He's a scorpion spider mix. He even has an ability that he can stick you with his tail, and you basically heat up for a brief amount of time, and he sets you on fire. Of course, he has his familiar attacks from the OG, but he also has a few new ones, even sticking his tail in the ground and sending it up like a catapult and sending out shockwaves of lava and fire down like comets. So there's a lot of new moves that he can do. And I would love to see this. Like, Phantom would be a beast in this, and he would have more weak points as the next fight, you know, not just attacking his pinchers or his face, more you do damage to him. The armor that was once his greatest, you know, asset, being very thick, slowly, you know, starts to come off and reveal a lot more chunks of his body that you can exploit. His tail being one of his many weaknesses, his face being another, or his pinchers and stuff like that. So it would reveal more parts of his body that you can take advantage of. Now moving on to Mundus. Now this fight, I roughly had a very challenging time coming up with ideas for it, because this is the last fight in the game. And honestly, I struggled very muchly when it came to this, because with DMC5, Urizen, you know, has a similar amount of power that Mundus had, and they kind of tried to do stuff similar to what they did with Mundus in that game. But with this boss fight, I was, you know, trying to balance that battle of power, like Dante getting the form of his father, battling this angel-looking stone man, the king of the underworld, the demon of true power. Almost on par with the satanic god, you know, in a sense. And after raking my brain for a month and a half, I couldn't come up with anything of how to remake this fight. I'm fully aware that a lot of people are going to say, well, that's odd. Hell, you didn't even talk about Shadow. Shadow's boss fight is so basic, you improve it a little bit, you keep it the same. That's it. Mundus was the one that really, I couldn't come up with anything, because I wanted to keep the foundational elements of it where it's a battle of power. And I know that this boss fight is in 2 stages, like you fight him in a void, and I roughly wanted to keep that element of it, but I found it to be, like, the boss fight does show its age, and he is powerful. Like, Mundus is god tier. And I couldn't really come up with a lot that really set the bar for this. How do you replicate that feeling? Like, I know it's like a flying run and gun thing for the first stage and stuff like that, but if anyone has any ideas for this boss in particular of how you could remake it for a Devil May Cry 1 remake, know in the comments. I would love to hear some interesting ideas and takes on this boss, because I want it to still feel like a battle of power. It's, you know, stuff that it has. I know that this boss is still kind of because it's like, it's a flying run and gun thing, and it wouldn't take too much to improve it, but I don't know. Like, it has those core, almost elements that make it feel unique, even if some things are outdated. I'm well aware, but I really hope you guys like this video of how Capcom should remake Devil May Cry 1. I have a lot of other videos. I'm sorry this one is late. I really appreciate it if you share this video. Let me know what you guys think of it, and let me know some ideas you guys have. I love reading suggestions, so let me know. And I do have my rewrite of the remake
Resident Evil 3
coming up soon, and a how Capcom should remake Devil May Cry 4 video coming up sometime later on, depending on how long it takes to make. These videos take a very long time, so yeah. I really appreciate you guys. Thank you. Peace out. Bye-bye.